Welcome to session 4 of Surveying Christianity's African Roots. From the upper room to Egypt, to Cyrene, to underground gatherings, emerge Berbers of the way. Let's begin with an overview of session 3. In session 3, we talked about after Jesus's resurrection and his ascension, the lifestyle of his followers. It was referred to as the way, and they were an illegal, subcultural religious sect that met in each other's homes. Growing in numbers and influence, these Messianic Hebrew followers were distrusted. And from 66 AD to 117 AD, the Hebrews of Cyrene, Egypt, Judea, and Mesopotamia lived under the colonizing rule of the Roman Empire. Scripture reflects their reassuring perspective when facing inescapable persecution within the Roman Empire. They fled west along the Mediterranean coast, as well as south down the Nile River, spreading the good news from the upper room about God's worldwide mission for his church. Their need to exist underground had left little to no historic footprint for researchers to pick upon to determine how the gospel was spread or when it actually arrived in certain regions. Now, the next 3 to 4 slides will set the stage for the events that we're going to learn about today. Let's begin to talk about the situation of life for these Christian Africans. It's 2 generations beyond the upper room. They gathered underground in African territories that were Romanized provinces. Let me talk about the types of sources used in these lectures. The contents for Surveying Christianity's African Roots were derived from ancient accounts of eyewitnesses, letters by persecuted African clergy, archaeological discoveries, ancient maps, and books written by African church fathers, and transcripts from Roman court trials of African followers of the way, as well as other known historic accounts beginning in the 2nd century AD. The followers of the way, they began as a minority. They frequently argued with Hebrews, pagans, and Greek philosophers about the nature of Christ and or about his body. They had no religious institutions. There was no universally agreed upon doctrine. And there is no common homeland for followers of the way. They were in Africa, they were in Asia Minor, they were in Judea, they were even in Europe. And so this time between session 3 and going underground, escaping the persecution, to the timing of session 4 was about 2 generations. So let's take a closer look at the time lapse between those events. Well, what seemed to be a sudden emergence of indigenous Berber Christians in and around Numidia and Carthage in 180 AD was evidence that the stealthy underground gatherings had grown significantly for over 2 generations. And as we said in session 3, to date, historians are unable to pinpoint when or how these Berbers came to Christ. Nevertheless, by 180 AD in Numidia and Africa Proconsularis, indigenous African converts were confident enough to openly practice their Christian faith. Let's see the landscape of this colonized area across Africa's northwest. You can see this map in session 4, exhibit 1.1 in your SCAR presentation outline. And on this map, there are places where martyrdom occurred that will be mentioned in this session. And I'm going to name 4 of the places that I want you to hone in on. There's Martyrs, there's Skillium, there's Leptis Magnus, and there's Carthage. In the purple area, you'll see the Africa Proconsularis. Proconsularis is a Latin word for province. It was a Roman territorial administrative jurisdiction in the empire's possessions outside of Italy. This part of Africa was Rome's Africa province. So the question is, how did the way emerge within the subculture there? And remember that in the eyes of the broader society, the followers of the way, as we saw in session 3, appeared to be antisocial and anti-Roman. That is part of the landscape, part of the social and political background that's going to set the stage for a subsequent content here. So with that said, here's what we are going to learn in session 4. We're going to answer the question of what divinely inspired writings were available to African followers of the way. What was the social political context within which the gospel spread? How do we explain the emergence of the way in Numidia and Africa Proconsularis? How did early 2nd century Roman writers view Christians? Who was Africa's first Christian martyr? How widespread was the influence of Berbers? How did Rome's edict of 202 AD affect African Christians? So let's begin talking about the divinely inspired writings that were available to African followers of the way. By 180 AD, already circulating across Christendom in a complete, or in some instances, partial form, were the Old Testament books for over 300 years. Matthew, Mark, Luke's gospel for over 120 years. Apostle Paul's letters for over 120 years. Apostle John's gospel and letters, his book of Revelation manuscripts for over 80 years, as well as other manuscripts about Christ and or Christian living. Also, by 180 AD, were functional worship. And the term Catholic at that time simply meant a universal whole, as in unity. Testimonials and rational defenses for the beliefs and their faith in the sacred writings, as urged in 2 Timothy 2:15, 1 Peter 3:15, and Revelation 12:11. By the end of the 2nd century, the first school for educating converts to the Christian faith was established. It was the Catechetical School of Alexandria in Egypt. But as always the case, the spiritual must be lived out in the natural realm, which takes us to the social and political context within which the gospel spread. First, let's talk about Numidia and Mauritania in this context. They were agricultural areas west of Carthage. A great deal of their produce was exported to Italy through Carthage. In Carthage, there was a strongly Latinized or Romanized class of landowners, merchants, and military officers who reaped more of the benefits of trade and other contacts with Italy than the Numidians and the Mauritanian workers who actually raised the crops. Settlers from across the empire had migrated there, forming a Latin-speaking ethnic mix. The Carthaginian society became a mixture of native Phoenician-speaking Berbers, Phoenicians, and Berber-speaking Africans who gradually became Romanized. The Berbers, however, and towns in Numidia and Mauritania were much less Romanized than Carthage and retained their African ancestral language and customs. They viewed Rome and everything connected with it as oppressive and foreign. Also, throughout Africa Proconsularis and Numidia and Mauritania and Carthage and the outlying districts, there was a significant lower class with similar feelings as the Numidians and Mauritanians about the Romans. As often the case with port or cosmopolitan cities, the gospel spread amongst the northwest coast of Africa. It had made significant inroads into Numidia and among the lower classes of Africa Proconsularis, and to a lesser degree into Mauritania. Though Christianity spread amongst the Berbers population, it was not without challenges, which takes us to the emergence of Christianity in Numidia and Africa Proconsularis. One of the challenges was the fact that followers of the way had emerged within an empire that was already religious. The Roman cultivators and Romanized people living in African territories within the empire worshiped the gods believed to have founded Rome, in addition to individual family idols. And so from their point of view, followers of the way were the atheists. Another challenge was Rome's long-standing policy of one country, two systems, also known as syncretism. The empire tolerated other religions as long as the worshipers in that religion included the honor of Roman gods. The reason for this was because Rome's emperors believed that it would be offensive to their own gods for the empire to tolerate its citizens to ignore the Roman gods. And that would bring instability throughout the empire as a consequence. Rome's practice of syncretism was in conflict with the Christian and Hebrew one and only one God belief. And by the end of the 2nd century AD, even as a subculture, followers of Christ were equipped to thrive. The momentum was mounting in Africa. And that's when things started to get dangerous for African Christians. These circumstances compelled them to be defensive apologists who were aggressive about the existence of the way and were intimately loyal to Christ. Let's look at how early 2nd century Roman writers viewed Christians. These are Rome's mainstream view of Christians throughout the empire. Let's look at Tacitus' view. It's a quote from his writings. There's a group hated for their abominations called Christians by the people. Christus, from whom the name comes, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our officials, Pontius Pilate. And then there's Suetonius. He says, the Christians are a class of men given to a new and wicked superstition. And then there's Celsus. Jews and Christians alike are compared to a flock of bats or to ants that creep forth out of their nests, or to frogs sitting around a swamp, or worms holding an assembly in a corner of the mud and debating on the question of which of them are the greatest sinners. Then we have Lucian. He says, the poor wretches have convinced themselves that they are going to be immortal and live for all time by worshiping that crucified sophist and living under his laws. Therefore, they despise the things of this world and consider them common property. They receive their doctrine by tradition without any definite evidence. And then Pliny the Younger, they were accustomed to meet on a fixed day before dawn and sing responsively a hymn to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by oath, not to some crime, but not to commit fraud, theft, adultery, or falsify their trust, nor to refuse to return a trust when called upon to do so. When this was over, it was their custom to depart and to assemble again and partake of food, but ordinary and innocent food, for the contagion of this superstition has spread, not only to the cities, but also to the villages and farms. But it seems possible to check and curb it. The Roman proconsul in these African territories within the Roman Empire insisted on Africans worshiping their gods. Plus, and Romans' fear of contagious Christians grew toxic, which brings us to the first African martyr. 180 AD was the year of the first persecution of African Christians for their Christian way of life. First we have Nathaniel. He was a Berber from Martyrs, Numidia, and he was the first African martyr. You don't find him in any of the Roman court transcripts, and we are made aware of him from a 4th century letter written by the Berber and great early church father, Augustine of Hippo, to a countryman. He refers to Nathanael as the first martyr. Now, Nathanael lived in Martyrs, Numidia, and it's a town with a population of Berbers who spoke mainly Latin. It's located in Northwest Africa, where the gospel had began to flourish. The actual date of this persecution is unknown, but as I mentioned, Augustine, being a credible source, holds him to be the first Christian martyr. He doesn't describe the circumstance of his martyrdom, nor does he describe the type of death. And then we have Spiritus and his students. And they were from Scilium, Numidia. And they were the first officially recorded court trial of African Christian martyrs. So Spiritus was a teacher of these students, these 12 students, and they refused to worship the emperor and or Roman gods. The Roman proconsul ordered that they be brought before him in Carthage, and they were given a chance to honor the Roman gods. They refused. I want to read a translated excerpts from their Roman court transcript. The proconsul tells them, you can win the clemency of our Lord the Emperor if you change your minds. Spiritus said, we have never done ill. We have not been inclined to do wrong. We have never spoken ill. When treated wrong, we have given thanks because we pay heed to our emperor. And the proconsul said, well, we Romans are religious too. Our religion is simple, and we swear by the genius of our Lord the Emperor and pray for his welfare, as you also taught to do. The proconsul goes on to say to Spiritus, do you wish to continue being a Christian? Spiritus says in return, I am a Christian. And then all the rest of them agree. The proconsul goes on to say, will any of you need time to reconsider your answer? Spiritus says, in all honesty, there is nothing to reconsider. And then the proconsul reads out the decree, and he names all of them. It says, having confessed that they live according to the Christian rite, since after the opportunity offered them of returning to the custom of the Romans, they have ostensibly persisted. It is determined that they be put to the sword. And Spiritus says, we give thanks to God. And one of the 12 says, today we are martyrs in heaven. Thanks be to God. Those two instances represent the very first martyr, which is not recorded, and then the very first officially recorded court trial of African Christian martyrs. But the Romanized Berbers who frequented the city of Rome, their experiences with the Roman Empire was a bit different. So let's consider the rising influence of Berbers in Rome. In 189 AD, On the other side of the Mediterranean Sea in Rome, the African Berber Victor I from Litis Magna became the 14th Pope of the Church in Rome. Again, this was long before today's brand of papal authority. Apparently, the Christian subculture living in Rome accepted the one country, two system policies. And perhaps this is one reason for the belief that the gospel of Jesus Christ didn't spread from the north of the Mediterranean into Africa, but rather came from the east by way of Cyrene. Evidence during this time suggests that race, as we know it today, was not as big of an issue as it is today. One's culture or one's politics became more divisive. The state religion of Rome had remained pagan from a Christian point of view. The state insisted on honoring the gods whom they believed had founded the city of Rome. Unlike in Africa, the Christians of Rome, for the most part, embraced Rome's practice of one country, two systems. Now back to Victor I. Victor was well known and also disliked for his intolerance of the different dates for celebrating Passover and Easter between the churches in the eastern and those in the western part of the Roman Empire. Also, in terms of rising influence of Berbers in Rome, in 193 AD, Septimius Severus, also from Litis Magna, became emperor of Rome. Septimius was a Berber. He may not have had disdain for Christians, but he sensed a threat as the sect, the Way, had gained influence through converting his citizens. In an effort to retain the favor of the Roman gods, in 202 AD, Emperor Septimius enacted a law that prohibited the spread of the gospel and Judaism. This was the first universal decree by the state of Rome that criminalized conversion to the Way. Violent persecutions broke out in Egypt as well as in North Africa. And again, Rome didn't have a problem with race. For them, it was more about control, particularly controlling the threat of this growing population of Christians in Africa. To tolerate this growth in their one country, two system practice ran the risk of offending the Roman gods. Well, there were two Christian African women that had a problem with Septimius' edict of 202 that criminalized conversion to Christianity. These two women were Perpetua and Felicitas. Defying the emperor's edict, these two women followed through with their final and formal act of conversion into the sect, the Way. This occurred in Carthage in 202 or 203 AD. Perpetua, she was married, she was wealthy, she was cultured, she was a prominent woman of Carthage, and she was also nursing an infant. Felicitas was a pregnant household servant of Perpetua. As the story goes, Perpetua, around 22 years old, and Felicitas, being her servant, had begun the final process of converting to the Way. They had already received a training in teaching and in discipline. The Roman soldiers arrested the two young mothers, along with 3 men, for becoming Christians against the emperor's edict. They had completed the final step of baptism which was a formal external declaration that they had converted to the way. After being imprisoned, Perpetua's father pleaded with her not to take this final formal step of converting to the way. But both women refused. They followed through with the baptism, arrested, they were tried, and they were sentenced to be thrown into the arena with lions. Well, the lionesses in the arena refused to attack and eat them. And so the Roman soldiers were ordered to thrust the women with their swords. Christian Africa had fought to maintain its strong, intimate relationship with Christ. And this fight was just the beginning. We're going to close here, but this is by no means an ending. We are just beginning to delve into the vast details about which mainstream church history sources have given less visibility, and what Christian Africans of the diaspora ought to know. For next session 5, we're going to talk about the ways need to codify their beliefs and lifestyle. The African church fathers who formed early doctrine and hermeneutics. Crises and pandemic throughout the Roman Empire. Rome's edict and syncretism. The required certificate of sacrifice to Roman gods. And more about African martyrs and Christians with a lapse in faith, as well as Anthony the Great, the father of monasticism. So in that chapter, we'll be in the 2nd through the end of the 3rd century AD, and that would be chapters 7 and 8 in our survey book. Again, for the next 6 sessions, we will explore the locations, the faith, and contributions of African citizens from the 1st through the 6th century AD. So follow along with these lectures in the book, Surveying Christianity's African Roots by Jimmy Compton. You can purchase a spiral-bound book from lulu.com, or you can purchase the regularly bound book from amazon.com. Thank you very much.